Previously, in Part 1, Jessica Lane, a daycare caregiver, trusted her instincts when she noticed something unsettling about little Emily Carter. The child's fear of going home, her reluctance to leave, and her father's cold, controlling demeanor sent a chill through Jessica's spine. When Mark Carter took an unexpected detour into the woods instead of heading home, Jessica knew something wasn't right. Following them led her to a terrifying discovery: a home filled with fear, a mother trapped in an abusive nightmare, and a father willing to do the unthinkable. But thanks to Jessica's courage and quick thinking, Emily and her mother, Meline, were finally freed from Mark's grasp. The police intervened, Mark was arrested, and for the first time, Emily had hope for a future without fear. But the story doesn't end here. Because even though Mark is gone, the scars he left behind remain. In Part 2, we'll follow Meline and Emily as they begin their journey toward healing. But with Mark behind bars, will they finally be safe? Or will his influence linger, threatening to pull them back into the darkness? And what about Jessica? Will she be able to move on from that fateful night, or will the weight of what she witnessed change her forever? The answers lie ahead. And once again, it all starts with a choice.
Jessica stepped into the daycare that morning and was immediately met with a burst of color. Balloons floated gently along the ceiling, their bright ribbons swaying in the air-conditioned breeze. Streamers crisscrossed the walls, weaving through the cheerful drawings the children had made throughout the week. And right in the center of the room, hanging just above the art station, was a handmade banner that read, "Happy Birthday, Miss Jessica," in big, uneven letters. Some of the children had clearly helped write it, their letters wobbly but filled with excitement. A warm smile spread across Jessica's face as she took it all in. She had never expected anything like this. Last year, her birthday had been just another ordinary day, barely acknowledged beyond a few kind words from coworkers. But this was different. The children were buzzing with energy, their laughter echoing through the room as they worked on their morning activities. Jessica had chosen to wear a shimmering fairy costume for the day, just for fun, and it had immediately captivated the kids. Emily, in particular, couldn't stop staring, her wide blue eyes filled with wonder. "Miss Jessica, look." Jessica turned at the sound of Emily's voice and saw the little girl hurrying toward her, a piece of paper clutched in her small hands. Emily beamed as she held up a crayon drawing. Jessica crouched down, taking the picture carefully, her heart swelling the moment she realized what it was. It was a fairy, a tall, graceful figure with golden hair and wings that sparkled in different colors. But it wasn't just any fairy. The long dress, the kind smile, the way she stood in front of a group of tiny stick-figure children as if shielding them. "Emily," Jessica breathed, feeling a lump form in her throat. "Is this me?" Emily nodded eagerly, her pigtails bouncing. "Yes, you're a fairy princess. You keep all of us safe." For a moment, Jessica couldn't speak. The weight of those words settled deep in her chest, bringing an unexpected sting to her eyes. She had always known how much she cared about these children, but hearing it from Emily in such a pure, innocent way, it was overwhelming. Jessica gently ran her fingers over the crayon strokes, careful not to smudge the colors. "Sweetheart, this is the most beautiful gift I've ever gotten," she said softly. "Thank you so much." Emily grinned proudly. "You have to put it on the art wall." "Of course," Jessica said with a laugh, standing up. She walked over to the colorful corkboard where the children's drawings were displayed and pinned Emily's masterpiece right in the center. The room was still filled with joy when the afternoon wore on, but Jessica's mind drifted as she helped the children with their crafts. A month ago, everything had been different. A month ago, she wouldn't have imagined herself standing here, feeling this sense of fulfillment, this deep connection to a little girl who had once been so afraid. She had come into Emily's life as nothing more than a daycare worker. Now, she felt like something more, a protector, a guardian, and maybe even family. The clock on the wall chimed softly, pulling her from her thoughts. Jessica glanced up and realized the time, 5 p.m. Parents would be arriving soon for pickup, and sure enough, her phone buzzed in her pocket with the usual notifications. She glanced at the screen, scrolling through the names of parents who had checked in. Then, one name caught her eye: Madeline Carter. Jessica's eyebrows knitted together in mild surprise. Madeline was early today. That almost never happened. She turned to find Emily, who was stacking blocks with 2 other children. Smiling, she walked over and knelt beside her. "Emily, guess what? Mommy's here early today." Emily's face lit up, and she immediately scrambled to her feet. "Really? Really?" Jessica confirmed, holding out her hand. "Let's go get your things ready, okay?" Emily wasted no time, grabbing Jessica's hand as they made their way to the cubbies. She quickly collected her backpack, her water bottle, and, most importantly, her beloved stuffed bunny. Jessica helped her tie her shoes, chuckling softly as Emily wiggled her feet, making the little lights on her sneakers flash. "All set," Jessica said, standing up and offering Emily her hand again. Hand in hand, they walked toward the front reception area where Madeline was waiting. The moment they stepped into the room, Madeline's face softened into a smile. "There's my girl," she said warmly, bending down and opening her arms. Emily let go of Jessica's hand and ran straight into her mother's embrace, wrapping her small arms tightly around Madeline's legs. Madeline scooped her up easily, planting a soft kiss on her cheek. Then, her gaze lifted to Jessica. "And there's her birthday girl." Jessica let out a small laugh as Madeline stepped forward and pulled her into a hug. It was warm, genuine, filled with a quiet gratitude that words couldn't quite capture. "Happy birthday, Jessica," Madeline murmured. "And thank you for everything." Jessica returned the hug, feeling the weight of those words. "Thank you, Madeline. That means a lot." As they pulled apart, Madeline reached into her purse and pulled out a small, beautifully wrapped gift. "This is for you," she said, handing it to Jessica. "I know Emily already gave you something, but I wanted to add a little something too. I hope you like it." Jessica blinked in surprise. "Oh, Madeline, you didn't have to do this. Open it. Open it." Emily chimed in, bouncing excitedly in her mother's arms. Jessica laughed. "I think I'll save it for later, sweetie, but thank you both so much." She turned to Emily, her heart swelling all over again. "Your drawing today was already the best gift I could have asked for." Madeline smiled down at her daughter. "Did you, honey? That was very thoughtful of you." Emily beamed with pride, hugging her stuffed bunny close to her chest. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. Jessica took a breath, then glanced at Madeline. "You're early today," she said casually. "How are you doing? Especially after, the news about Mark's bail last week." The shift in Madeline's expression was almost imperceptible. A flicker of something, hesitation, uncertainty, crossed her face before she smiled again, though this time, it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Actually," she said slowly, "that's part of why I'm early." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. "Mark contacted me 3 days ago," Madeline continued, her voice quiet. "And I just had a short meeting with him and our lawyers about an hour ago." Jessica felt the room tilt slightly, her body tensing at those words. "A meeting? With Mark? But isn't there a restraining order?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Madeline nodded. "There is. But he sent me a bouquet of roses and an apology letter. He says he's changed, Jessica, and when I saw him today, he did look better than he has in a long time." Jessica's stomach twisted. This wasn't right. This wasn't safe. Her gut was screaming at her. Madeline must have seen the worry in her eyes because she quickly added, "It was just a meeting. Nothing more. We discussed legal matters, things about the house, belongings, nothing that involves the courts." Jessica swallowed hard, but she forced a nod. She had seen this before. The slow, careful way an abuser crept back in. She had to be careful. She had to make sure Madeline didn't fall back into the trap. And she had to protect Emily. No matter what. Jessica's stomach twisted into knots as she absorbed Madeline's words. Mark had been released. The daycare had always felt like a safe place, a space where the world outside couldn't touch them, where Emily could simply be a child. But now, the security Jessica had fought so hard to create felt as fragile as a house of cards. One gust of wind, one wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. She studied Madeline carefully, searching for any sign of doubt in her friend's face. But Madeline was calm, too calm. It wasn't the kind of relief that came from knowing things would be okay. It was the kind of calm that people forced onto themselves when they needed to believe in something, even if they weren't sure they truly did. Jessica kept her voice steady, but her pulse pounded in her ears. "Mark contacted you? How?" Madeline hesitated, glancing down at Emily, who was still clutching her stuffed bunny, happily oblivious to the storm brewing around her. "A letter," she admitted softly. "And flowers. They arrived at the house 3 days ago." Jessica's breath hitched. 3 days. That meant Madeline had been sitting with this information, turning it over in her mind, long before she had decided to tell her. That meant she had already started convincing herself that maybe, just maybe, Mark was telling the truth. Jessica forced herself to stay calm, even as every fiber of her being screamed in protest. "What did the letter say?" Madeline sighed, shifting Emily's weight in her arms. "That he's changed, that he's been going to therapy, working on himself, that he's sorry for everything he did." Her lips pressed together, her voice dropping even lower. "He said he still loves us, that he wants to make things right." Jessica clenched her jaw, anger bubbling beneath the surface. It was a script, one she had heard before, one she had seen before. Abusers didn't change overnight. They didn't wake up one morning and suddenly understand the depth of their sins. They learned the right words, the ones that would make their victims hesitate just long enough to let them back in. "He said all that in a letter?" Jessica asked carefully. Madeline nodded, her fingers brushing absently over Emily's back, soothing an anxiety she wouldn't admit to feeling. "And then he reached out to my lawyer. Said he wanted to discuss some things, property, finances, the car. Nothing that involves Emily." Jessica swallowed hard, her gut twisting. This wasn't just about a letter. This wasn't just about flowers. Mark was laying down the foundation, brick by careful brick, building a road back into their lives. "I met with him this afternoon," Madeline continued, as if she could sense the next question forming on Jessica's lips. "Just for legal matters. I didn't bring Emily. It was civil. He looked different, Jess. Healthier, more put together than I've seen him in years." Jessica took a slow breath, keeping her expression neutral. "Did he say anything about wanting to see Emily?" Madeline hesitated just long enough that it made Jessica's stomach drop. "He said he wanted to eventually," she admitted, "but he understands that it's too soon." Jessica's skin prickled. It was too soon? Not never, not absolutely not, just too soon. That was how it started. Jessica took a careful step forward, lowering her voice even more. "Madeline, I need you to be honest with me. Are you thinking about letting him back into Emily's life?" Madeline stiffened, her grip tightening ever so slightly around her daughter. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't want to, but Emily asks about him. She misses him. And if he's really changed, if he's really trying to be better." Jessica inhaled sharply, her heart hammering in her chest. She had to tread carefully. Pushing too hard would make Madeline retreat, and she couldn't afford that right now. She reached out, placing a gentle but firm hand on Madeline's arm. "Listen to me," she said softly. "I know you want to believe he's different. I know you want Emily to have her father. But you and I both know that people like Mark, they don't just change overnight. They pretend to change when they realize they're losing control." Madeline's jaw tightened. "I'm being careful." Jessica's fingers curled slightly against her arm, trying to anchor her to reality. "Being careful means keeping him as far away from Emily as possible," she said. "Being careful means remembering what he's already done." A shadow flickered across Madeline's face, a crack in the wall she was trying so desperately to hold up. "I haven't made any decisions yet," she admitted, looking away. "I told her we need time. That Emily needs time." Jessica let out a slow breath, easing back just slightly. It wasn't the reassurance she wanted, but it was something. She dropped her hand, forcing herself to keep her tone light. "Just promise me something?" Madeline glanced back at her, wary but listening. "If he reaches out again, if he asks to see Emily, if he sends more letters, please tell me," Jessica said. "Let me help you. You don't have to go through this alone." Madeline hesitated, then finally gave a small nod. "Okay." It wasn't a promise, but it was something. Jessica knew she wouldn't stop worrying, Not until she was absolutely sure that Mark was out of their lives for good. But as she watched Madeline and Emily walk out of the daycare together, disappearing into the evening light, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That evening, Jessica finally allowed herself to breathe. The daycare had been filled with laughter and joy all day, the children showering her with hugs, drawings, and off-key renditions of the happy birthday song. It had been overwhelming in the best way. And as she sat in her small living room, surrounded by the gifts and handmade cards she had brought home, she felt an unfamiliar warmth settle in her chest. This was happiness. True, unfiltered happiness. She reached for a stack of cards first, flipping through each one carefully. Tiny, wobbly letters spelled out, "We love you, Miss Jessica." Some cards were covered in glitter, others in crayon scribbles, but every single one carried the same message: you are loved. She smiled to herself, setting them aside as she moved on to the small collection of trinkets and wrapped presents. Parents had sent thoughtful little gifts, gift cards, candles, chocolates, but the ones that touched her the most were from the children. A beaded bracelet, a keychain made of yarn, a lopsided clay heart with "Best Teacher" scrawled across it. Then, her fingers brushed against a familiar package. Madeline's gift. Jessica hesitated, staring down at the delicate wrapping. She had told Emily she would wait until she got home to open it, and now that she was here, she wasn't sure why she felt so nervous. Taking a slow breath, she carefully peeled away the paper, revealing a small velvet box. Her pulse quickened slightly as she opened it. Inside, nestled against the soft fabric, was a silver bracelet. It was simple yet beautiful, with a delicate chain and a single charm in the shape of a guardian angel. Jessica ran her fingertips over it, feeling the smooth, cool metal, and something deep inside her chest tightened. A guardian angel. She swallowed hard, emotions she hadn't expected welling up inside her. She wasn't sure if Madeline had chosen it intentionally or if it was just a coincidence, but the symbolism hit her hard. A protector, a guide, someone who watched over others, even when they didn't realize it, even when it hurt. Blinking quickly, Jessica pulled the bracelet from the box and clasped it around her wrist. It was light, almost weightless, but somehow it felt like a silent promise. A reminder of why she had fought so hard for Emily and Madeline, why she would continue to fight. She exhaled softly, setting the empty box down on the coffee table. But as she did, she noticed something else, a neatly folded piece of paper tucked beneath it. Curious, she picked it up, unfolding it with careful hands. And then she saw the check. Her breath caught in her throat. $5,000. The number practically screamed at her from the slip of paper, her hands tightening instinctively around it as her mind scrambled to make sense of it. She read the note attached, Madeline's familiar handwriting looping across the page. "Jessica, I know this can never be enough to thank you for everything you've done for us. You changed our lives, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay that. But I do know how much you love the daycare, and I've heard you talk about expanding. Please use this to help make that happen. Or use it for yourself. You deserve that, too." Jessica sat back, stunned. Madeline had saved up for this? She knew Madeline wasn't wealthy. She had been struggling, juggling work, court hearings, and raising Emily on her own. And yet, she had somehow pulled together $5,000 to give away, not just to anyone, but to her. Jessica pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the sheer generosity of it. But beneath the gratitude, beneath the deep, bone-deep appreciation, something else gnawed at her. Worry. Because no matter how much she wanted to believe this was simply Madeline's way of giving back, of showing her thanks, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was also guilt. That maybe, just maybe, Madeline was trying to convince herself that everything was okay. That if she gave back, if she showed her appreciation, it would somehow make it true. Jessica closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. She wanted to call Madeline, to tell her how much this meant, to make sure she hadn't put herself into financial hardship over this. But something told her that now wasn't the time. Not yet. Instead, she glanced down at the bracelet on her wrist, running her thumb over the angel charm. She would accept this gift, but she would also stay vigilant. Because no matter how much Madeline wanted to believe things were okay, Jessica knew, deep in her gut, that the storm was far from over. The next morning, Jessica woke with a sense of purpose. After spending the night, reflecting on Madeline's generosity, she decided that a simple thank you text wouldn't be enough. She needed to see her in person to express just how much the gift, and more importantly, the thought behind it, meant to her. So, after baking a warm breakfast casserole, she carefully wrapped it in a towel to keep it hot and set off toward Madeline's house. The drive was short, just 10 minutes through the quiet suburban streets. It was a crisp, cool morning, and the sun cast a golden glow over the neighborhood, illuminating tree-lined roads and neatly trimmed lawns. Everything looked peaceful, ordinary. Jessica tried to let that soothe the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at her ever since their conversation yesterday. She pulled into the driveway and grabbed the casserole, smiling as she walked up the front steps. The sound of laughter filtered from inside the house, a child's high-pitched giggles mixed with something deeper, richer. A man's voice. Jessica's steps slowed. Her grip on the casserole tightened. Something was wrong. She rang the doorbell, her heart already beginning to pound, though she wasn't sure why. A few seconds passed before she heard footsteps approaching from inside. The door swung open, and Jessica's blood ran cold. Mark stood in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jessica felt as if the world had tilted beneath her feet, her body frozen in place. She had imagined this moment before, running into him unexpectedly, perhaps at a grocery store, seeing him from a distance, knowing he was out on bail. But she had never thought she would see him here. At Madeline's house, his expression was neutral, almost casual, but there was something about it that made her stomach turn. His presence filled the doorway, and though he didn't make a move toward her, Jessica felt an overwhelming urge to step back, to run. Mark was the first to speak. "Miss Jessica." He said her name evenly, almost pleasantly, as if they were two acquaintances who had run into each other by chance. "We didn't expect you here." Jessica's mind scrambled for words, but all she could manage was a shaky, "I." She stopped herself, gripping the casserole dish tighter, as if it were an anchor, keeping her steady. "I wasn't expecting you to be here either." Mark raised an eyebrow slightly. "Why wouldn't I be? This is my home." No, it wasn't. Not anymore. Jessica's pulse roared in her ears. She had to stay calm, had to think. Her fingers twitched toward her pocket, toward her phone. "Mr. Carter," she said carefully, keeping her voice as level as she could. "You have a restraining order. You're not supposed to be here." Before Mark could answer, another voice broke through. "Jessica." Madeline appeared behind him, stepping into view. Her expression was calm, but Jessica didn't miss the flicker of unease in her eyes. She glanced between them, taking in Jessica's stiff posture, Mark's unreadable gaze, the unspoken tension between them. Jessica latched onto her presence like a lifeline. "Madeline," she said, forcing herself to breathe. "What's going on?" Madeline exhaled, stepping forward past Mark. "I let him in." Jessica felt her heart drop. Madeline continued quickly, as if sensing Jessica's immediate protest. "He's changed, Jessica. Please, just see for yourself." Jessica's fingers curled into her palm, her fingernails pressing into her skin. "He's changed." The words rang hollow, like an echo of every desperate hope she had heard from victims before. She wanted to grab Madeline by the shoulders, shake her, make her see what she was doing. Instead, she took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "Madeline," she said carefully, "can I talk to you? Alone?" Madeline hesitated, glancing back at Mark. He simply gave her a small nod, his expression unreadable. "I'll be inside," he said, turning and walking back into the house. Jessica waited until he was out of earshot before she turned to Madeline, voice tight with barely restrained panic. "Are you serious right now?" Madeline sighed. "Jess." "No." Jessica shook her head, stepping closer. "You promised me. Just yesterday, you told me you weren't going to let him back in. You know what he's capable of." "I do," Madeline said quickly. "I do, Jessica. But he's different now. He's going to go to therapy. He's trying what exactly? Jessica cut in, her voice rising. Trying to undo what he did to you? To Emily. She swallowed hard, tried to rein in her emotions. Madeline, this is how it starts. They say all the right things. They make all the right moves. And then the moment you let them back in. He's not living here, Madeline interrupted, her voice firm but tired. He didn't stay the night. We're taking things slowly. I promise you, I would never let him hurt Emily again. Jessica clenched her jaw. And yet, Mark had been here. He had already crossed the line, and Madeline had let him. Jessica took a slow, steadying breath, forcing herself to soften her approach. She couldn't afford to push too hard, not if she wanted Madeline to listen. She looked at her friend, at the exhaustion in her eyes, the quiet desperation beneath the surface. You don't have to do this alone, Jessica said gently. You don't owe him this, Madeline. Madeline's gaze flickered downward. Emily misses him, she whispered. She asked about him all the time. Jessica's heart ached. Emily also used to hide from him, she reminded her. Do you remember that? Do you remember what it was like? Because I do. Her voice caught, but she pushed on. I remember the fear in her eyes when she flinched at loud noises. I remember how she would cling to you like you were the only safe thing in the world. Madeline squeezed her eyes shut, her fingers trembling slightly. Jessica reached out, taking her hands. I know you want to believe he's changed. I get it, but you can't risk Emily's safety on hope. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Madeline opened her eyes, looking at Jessica with something raw and unreadable. I hear you, she murmured. Ido. Jessica searched her expression, trying to find something solid to hold on to. But deep in her gut, she knew the battle wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Jessica barely had time to process Madeline's words before a familiar, excited voice cut through the tension. Miss Jessica, Emily came bounding into the room, her small feet pattering against the floor as she threw herself into Jessica's arms. Jessica instinctively knelt, catching the little girl and hugging her tightly, the warmth of Emily's embrace momentarily easing the dread coiled in her chest. I didn't know you were coming over. Emily beamed up at her, eyes shining with excitement. Are you staying for lunch? Jessica forced a smile, ignoring the way her pulse pounded in her ears. I just stopped by to see your mommy, she said, tucking a loose strand of Emily's hair behind her ear. But I did bring a casserole for you too. Emily gasped dramatically, her hands flying to her mouth. Oh, is it the cheesy kind? Jessica chuckled, nodding. The cheesiest. Before she could say anything more, Emily turned toward the kitchen, her voice bright and innocent. Daddy, Miss Jessica made lunch for us. Can you eat with us too? Jessica felt her stomach drop. She had been so focused on Madeline, so caught up in her disbelief, that for a moment she had forgotten about the other presence in the house. But now, as Emily's words hung in the air, she felt it again, that suffocating, crawling unease. From across the room, Mark stepped forward. The air in the space shifted, an invisible weight pressing down on Jessica's shoulders. He moved slowly, deliberately, his posture relaxed, his expression neutral. But Jessica knew better than to trust what she saw on the surface. Mark smiled. It was the same smile she had seen him wear in old photos. The charming, easygoing mask of a man who knew exactly how to play his part. Well, he said smoothly, his eyes locking onto Jessica's, I suppose that depends. Do you mind if I join Miss Jessica? His voice was light, almost teasing, but Jessica could hear the undertone beneath it. She knew what he was doing. He was waiting for her reaction, testing her. If she said no, she would look like the one causing a scene. If she hesitated, it would only give him more power. And worst of all, Emily was watching. The little girl was looking up at her, completely unaware of the unspoken battle happening right in front of her. All she saw was her daddy, standing there, waiting for an answer. Jessica's throat was dry. She wanted to scream no, wanted to grab Emily and run, wanted to shake Madeline and demand to know how she could let this happen. But none of that would help right now. So, she did the only thing she could do. She smiled. It wasn't real, it was tight and forced, and if Mark had been paying close attention, he probably would have noticed the way her fingers trembled at her sides. But Emily didn't, and that was all that mattered. "Of course," Jessica said, her voice even controlled. "It's just a simple casserole, but I hope you like it." Mark's smile widened just slightly, as if he knew exactly what this cost her. "I'm sure it'll be great," he said. Jessica followed Madeline and Emily into the kitchen, her mind racing with every step. Mark had already won the first battle. He had been invited to eat with them. He had established his place at the table, quite literally, as if he belonged there. And that was dangerous, because if there was one thing Jessica knew for certain, it was that men like Mark didn't just want a meal. They wanted control. And now, she had to figure out just how much of it he had already taken back. Lunch was a carefully orchestrated performance. Jessica sat across from Mark, watching him the way someone might watch a coiled snake. Never breaking eye contact for too long, never fully relaxing, always anticipating the moment he might strike. Emily chattered happily between bites of casserole, oblivious to the tension hanging over the table like an unspoken threat. And Mark played his role perfectly. He was polite, charming even. He laughed at Emily's stories, complimented Madeline on how well she was handling things, even thanked Jessica for the meal. If Jessica hadn't known what he was capable of, she might have believed it. But she did know. She saw it in the small things. The way his hand lingered on Emily's back a second too long as he helped her into her chair. The way his gaze flickered to Madeline whenever she wasn't looking, his expression unreadable. The way he studied Jessica, like he was trying to figure out how much she had figured out. She felt like she was playing chess with a man who had already planned 10 moves ahead. And that terrified her. At one point, Mark set his fork down and leaned back slightly, giving Jessica a thoughtful look. "You know, Miss Jessica," he mused, "Emily talks about you all the time." Jessica tensed. Mark's eyes flickered toward his daughter with practiced fondness. "She says you tell her stories. About kindness, forgiveness." His gaze shifted back to Jessica, and something in it sharpened. "About second chances." Jessica's blood ran cold. He was toying with her, using her own words against her. Emily nodded enthusiastically, completely unaware of the tension tightening around the room. "Yeah, Miss Jessica says that if someone says sorry and really means it, we should forgive them." Jessica's heart squeezed painfully. She had told Emily that. It had been during story time, in a completely different context, long before Mark had come back. But now, those words had been twisted, used as a weapon against her. She forced herself to keep her expression neutral. "That's true, sweetheart," she said softly, "but only if they prove they've changed. Saying sorry isn't enough. We have to see their actions too." Mark tilted his head slightly, his smile never faltering. "Oh, absolutely," he agreed smoothly. "That's why I'm doing everything I can to make things right." Jessica said nothing, because anything she said right now would only add fuel to the fire. Madeline reached for a glass of water, clearing her throat as if sensing the growing tension. "So," she said, forcing a lighter tone, "how's the daycare, Jessica?" Jessica latched onto the change of subject like a lifeline. "It's been great," she said, setting her fork down carefully. "We've been working on some new activities for the kids, and Emily's been doing so well." Mark nodded, taking a slow sip of his drink. "I'm glad to hear that," he said. "She's lucky to have someone like you." Jessica wasn't sure if it was meant as a compliment or a warning, but she wasn't going to stick around to find out. She set her napkin down, offering a small, polite smile. "I should probably get going," she said, pushing back from the table. "I didn't mean to interrupt your day. I just want to drop off the food." Madeline hesitated, but then nodded. "Thank you for coming, Jess. And for this," she gestured to the casserole dish. "It means a lot." Emily pouted. "Do you have to go?" Jessica bent down, brushing a kiss to the top of her head. "I'll see you soon, okay?" she promised. As she turned to leave, she felt Mark's gaze on her, following her every step. And for the first time since she had arrived, she allowed herself to admit the truth she had been trying to ignore. Mark wasn't just back. He was winning. And if she didn't do something soon, she was going to lose Madeline and Emily forever. As Jessica stood up to leave, eager to escape the suffocating tension in the house, she heard Emily's excited voice once again. "Daddy, can we go to the park later?" Jessica paused mid-step, her grip tightening around the strap of her purse. Mark, who had been casually sipping his drink, set his glass down and smiled at his daughter. "That sounds like a great idea, sweetheart." He turned toward Madeline, his expression soft, almost expectant. "What do you think? A little picnic at the park? Just the three of us?" Jessica didn't miss the way Madeline's shoulders tensed, nor the hesitation that flickered across her face. "Oh, I don't know, Mark," she said slowly, glancing at Emily, who was already bouncing in anticipation. "It's kind of last minute." Emily clasped her hands together, her eyes wide with excitement. "Please, Mommy? Just for a little bit." Jessica felt her stomach twist. She didn't like this. Not one bit. This wasn't just an innocent picnic. It was Mark's way of testing boundaries, pushing to see how much he could get away with. And worse, he was using Emily to do it. Madeline bit her lip, torn between her daughter's happiness and the gnawing uncertainty in her own heart. Mark chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair as if he wasn't the least bit concerned. "Come on, Mads," he said easily. "It's just the park. You'll be there the whole time, and it'll make Emily happy." Jessica's jaw clenched. That was how it always started. A little thing, a harmless suggestion, something small enough that saying no would feel like an overreaction. Madeline glanced at Jessica, uncertainty flickering in her eyes, searching for guidance. Jessica didn't hesitate. She shot her a sharp, pointed look, a silent warning. "Don't do this." Madeline's fingers tightened around her napkin, and for a moment, Jessica thought she might refuse. But then Emily spoke again, her voice bright and eager. "We could bring my new stuffed bunny, too. We could have a tea party in the park." Jessica saw it happen in real time, the exact moment Madeline caved. The mother in her, the one who wanted so badly to give Emily something normal, overruled the part of her that knew better. "Okay," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jessica's heart sank. Emily let out a squeal of excitement, clapping her hands. Mark just smiled, satisfied. Jessica's grip tightened on her purse strap. She wanted to stop this, wanted to make Madeline see what was happening. But what could she do? The decision had already been made. If she pushed too hard, it might only make Madeline dig her heels in deeper. So instead, she forced herself to take a breath, steadied her voice, and spoke carefully. "A quick picnic," she said, looking directly at Mark. "That's all." Mark's lips twitched upward, amused by her attempt to set the rules. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Just a quick picnic." Jessica wasn't sure if she believed him. And the worst part? She wasn't sure if Madeline did, either. Jessica spent the rest of the afternoon trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in her bones. She kept telling herself that everything was fine. It was just a trip to the park. A few hours, and then they'd come home. She wanted to believe that, but she couldn't. Something about the whole thing felt wrong. The way Mark had so easily manipulated the situation, the way Madeline had hesitated but still agreed, it was all too familiar. By the time the clock ticked past 4, Jessica couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her phone and dialed Madeline's number. It rang, and rang, and rang. Then voicemail. Jessica frowned, lowering the phone. Maybe they were just busy. Maybe Madeline hadn't heard the call. She tried again, straight to voicemail. Her fingers tightened around the device, a sick feeling creeping up her spine. She tried to push down the panic, telling herself there had to be a logical explanation. But she knew better. Something wasn't right. Jessica stood up, pacing her small living room. Maybe Madeline's phone had died. Maybe she and Emily were just caught up in the fun and lost track of time. But that didn't explain why the call had gone straight to voicemail the second time. Jessica bit her lip, staring at her phone screen, her heart hammering against her ribs. And then, like a flash of lightning, she remembered. The neighbor. The old woman who had mentioned camping gear. The words came crashing back like a wave, drowning out any last bit of doubt she had left. Luggage. Gear. A picnic shouldn't require either of those things. Jessica grabbed her car keys without another thought. She didn't know exactly where they were, but she had one lead, and she prayed that she wasn't already too late. Jessica's tires screeched as she pulled into Madeline's driveway, the sinking sun casting long shadows over the quiet suburban street. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she threw the car in a park and practically leaped from the driver's seat. The house was dark, too dark. Jessica's stomach churned. She had expected to see Emily's bike lying in the yard, a light glowing from the living room, maybe even the faint hum of the television in the background. But there was nothing. No lights, no movement, no sign of life. Jessica rushed up the front steps, knocking hard on the door. Madeline, silence. She knocked again, harder this time. Emily, nothing. A chill crept up her spine. She tried the doorknob. It was locked. Something was very wrong. Just as she was about to take out her phone, movement from the corner of her eye made her turn. Across the lawn, standing on the porch of the neighboring house, was an elderly couple. They were watching her with cautious, concerned expressions, whispering to each other. Jessica hurried toward them. "Excuse me," she called out, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "I'm looking for Madeline and Emily Carter. Do you know if they've come home?" The woman, frail, with soft silver hair tucked behind her ears, exchanged a glance with her husband. Then she took a hesitant step forward. "They left about an hour ago," she said. Her voice was kind but uncertain, as if she wasn't sure whether she should be saying anything at all. Jessica's heart pounded. "Left? For the park?" The woman hesitated. The man, taller, with a weathered face and deep-set eyes, cleared his throat. "Looked like more than just a picnic, if you ask me." Jessica's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" The woman wrung her hands. "They had bags with them, suitcases, and some camping gear." Cold dread swept through Jessica's body. Camping gear, suitcases. This wasn't just a quick trip to the park. Jessica's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information she had gathered throughout the day. Mark had suggested the picnic. Madeline had hesitated, but ultimately agreed. Now they were gone, and they had taken luggage. A sinking feeling settled in Jessica's stomach. She turned back toward the house, as if somehow expecting them to suddenly appear, to tell her this was all a misunderstanding. But the house remained dark, empty, silent. She didn't have time to think. She turned back to the couple. "Did you see which direction they went?" The man nodded toward the main road, headed west, toward the outskirts of town. Jessica didn't waste another second. She sprinted back to her car, her hands shaking as she yanked the door open and jumped inside. She had no solid plan, just a gut instinct screaming at her that she had to find them. And fast. The roads blurred past as Jessica sped toward the outskirts of town, the sky darkening with each passing minute. She gripped the wheel, her knuckles white. Her mind raced through every possibility, every worst-case scenario that she didn't want to believe was happening. Mark wasn't just taking them to the park. He was taking them. Her breathing was shallow as she tried to think. Where would he go? Where could he take them where no one would find them? Then, a memory surfaced, one she hadn't even realized she had tucked away. The day Mark had taken Emily from daycare without permission, before Jessica had followed him. The moment she had seen him turn off the main road, heading toward the thick, secluded forest just outside of Tacoma. He had stopped there. Why? Jessica hadn't questioned it then. She had been too focused on Emily, on getting her back. But now it made sense. It was secluded, hidden, the perfect place to disappear. Jessica's grip tightened around the wheel. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. And if she was wrong, she couldn't afford to be. The trees loomed taller as she drove deeper into the forested area, the last traces of daylight bleeding into the horizon. Jessica's eyes scanned the roadside, searching. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she passed one trailhead after another, her stomach sinking with every empty turnoff. Then, a flash of red. Jessica slammed the brakes. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she stared at the vehicle parked just off the dirt road. Mark's car. She barely had time to register the weight of what she had just found before a sound shattered the quiet. A scream. Faint, distant, but unmistakably human. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. It came from the trees. Her hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone. She had to call the police, but her body was already moving. Jessica climbed out of the car, the cool evening air biting at her skin as she stepped onto the trail. Another sound. A cry. Her blood ran cold. Someone needed help, and she was the only one here. Jessica's hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling so badly that she nearly dropped it. The scream had already faded into the depths of the forest, swallowed by the trees. But the panic had ignited in her refused to fade. She forced herself to take a deep breath and pressed the emergency dial. 911, what's your emergency? Jessica struggled to steady her voice, but still came out strained, breathless. I think a woman and child are in danger, she managed, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles ached. I'm at the Tacoma Forest trailhead. I heard screaming. It sounded like someone was being hurt. The dispatcher's voice remained calm, professional. Can you confirm your location? Jessica turned, glancing at the small wooden sign marking the trail entrance. Yes, I'm near the north side, past mile marker 8. There's a red sedan parked here. It belongs to the man I think might be involved. His name is Mark Carter. The dispatcher's tone shifted slightly, sharp with recognition. We have a restraining order on file for a Mark Carter. Officers are being dispatched to your location now. Can you see anyone? Jessica swallowed hard, staring into the looming tree line. Darkness was beginning to creep in, stretching long shadows across the dirt path. No, she admitted, but I heard something. A scream. It sounded like Madeline. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a firm directive. Stay in your car, ma'am. Do not go into the woods. Officers will be there in minutes. Jessica clenched her jaw. She wanted to listen. She really did. But every second that passed felt like another moment wasted. Another moment where something horrible could be happening just out of sight. A rustling sound in the distance made her freeze. Her breath hitched, her pulse roaring in her ears. It wasn't the sound of the wind shifting through the trees. It was heavier, closer. Something or someone was out there. Then came a sound that sent ice through her veins. A low, guttural grunt. Jessica's body went rigid. The noise was deep, rough, almost animalistic. It wasn't a scream for help. It was a sound of struggle, and it was coming from the trees. Before she could react, flashing red and blue lights flooded the parking area. 3 patrol cars screeched to a stop, and officers poured out in swift, controlled movements, weapons already drawn. Jessica barely had time to step aside before the lead officer approached, his gaze hard. Are you the one who called? Jessica nodded rapidly, pointing toward the trailhead. I heard screaming, and just now, something else. It sounded like someone's hurt. The officer exchanged a quick glance with his team before motioning toward the forest. We move in. Stay here. Jessica's body protested. No, I need to go. I need to find them. But before she could argue, the officers were already charging into the woods, their flashlights slicing through the thickening darkness. She stood there, frozen in place, her hands curled into fists at her sides as the forest swallowed them whole. And then suddenly, a shout from one of the officers. Then another. We found her. Jessica's breath caught. For a split second, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process. Then her feet carried her forward before she could think better of it. She ran. The officer stationed near the patrol car shouted after her, but she didn't stop. She followed the sounds of movement, of urgent voices, of breaking branches and heavy footfalls. And then she saw them. A small clearing, barely illuminated by flashlight beams. Officers were gathered in a circle, kneeling. Madeline. Jessica's heart lurched into her throat. She was tied to a tree, ropes dug into her wrists and ankles, her head slumped forward, her body limp. She looked lifeless. Jessica let out a strangled sound, pure terror tightening around her ribs. Madeline, one of the officers caught her before she could collapse at her friend's side. She's alive, he reassured quickly, pressing 2 fingers to Madeline's neck. Pulse is weak, but she's breathing. Jessica barely heard him. Her gaze was locked onto Madeline's face, bruised, bloodied, her skin pale beneath the moonlight filtering through the trees. Oh my God! Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. The officers moved quickly, working to untie the ropes binding Madeline to the tree. One of them spoke into his radio, calling for an ambulance. Jessica dropped to her knees beside her, reaching out with trembling hands. "Madeline, it's me," she whispered, brushing damp hair away from her face. There was no response. Jessica's chest clenched. She had never seen Madeline look like this. So broken, so fragile. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some cruel coincidence. Mark had done this. And yet, Madeline was here. But where was Emily? Jessica's stomach lurched with a sickening realization. Madeline had been left behind. That meant Mark had taken Emily somewhere else. Her hands curled into fists. Her head snapped up, her gaze darting around the clearing, searching. "Where's Emily?" she demanded, voice tight with panic. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Jessica's heart slammed against her ribs. "Where's Emily?" she cried again, her voice breaking this time. No one answered, because no one knew, and that was far more terrifying than anything else. Jessica's pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out the distant shouts of officers as they worked to free Madeline. Every nerve in her body was on edge, her mind racing with one singular thought. Emily is still out there. Then she heard it. Soft, measured, deliberate. Footsteps. Jessica's breath hitched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as the sound crunched against the forest floor behind her. Slowly, cautiously, she turned, and her blood ran cold. Mark stood just a few feet away. Cradled in his arms, limp and unmoving, was Emily. Jessica's entire body locked up. Emily's tiny frame sagged against Mark's chest, her face pale in the dim glow of moonlight. Her little arms dangled at her sides, her head lolling slightly against his shoulder. Jessica's stomach twisted in sheer terror. Emily, her voice cracked, but she forced herself to stay calm, to keep her panic in check. She couldn't afford to lose control. Mark's grip on the little girl tightened. His eyes, wild and darting, snapped to Jessica's face, his entire body tense, coiled like an animal ready to strike. "You don't understand," he growled, his voice low, rough, unhinged. "I'm protecting her." Jessica swallowed the bile, rising in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to lunge forward, to rip Emily from his grasp. But she knew she couldn't. Not yet. Not when he was this unstable. She needed to stall him. Keep him talking. Her mind worked furiously to find the right words. "Mark," she said carefully, her voice steady despite the tremor threatening to break through. "I know you love Emily. I know you think you're doing the right thing." Mark's jaw clenched. He took a slow step backward, his grip on Emily firm. "You don't get it, Jessica. They were going to take her away from me. You all were. I couldn't let that happen." Jessica's chest tightened. He was spiraling. She needed to pull him back just enough. "Nobody is taking Emily," she lied, her voice gentle but firm. "She's right here, isn't she? She's safe with you." Mark's breathing was uneven. His eyes flickered. Uncertain, searching, caught between reality and whatever twisted logic his mind had convinced him was true. Jessica took the smallest step forward. "She's not safe out here, Mark," she said softly. "She needs to go home. She needs her mommy." At the mention of Madeline, something inside him snapped. Mark's expression twisted. "Her mother," he spat the word like it was poison. "Madeline turned her against me. She made me the enemy." Jessica forced herself to hold his gaze. "That's not true." Mark let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "You think I don't see it? You think I don't know what you've been telling her? That I'm a monster? That I'm some danger to my own daughter?" His breathing turned ragged. "I love her." Jessica's stomach churned, but she nodded, playing along. "I believe you." Mark blinked. Jessica seized the moment. "Let me help you," she said. "We can fix this, but you have to trust me. You have to put Emily down." Mark hesitated. For the first time since he had emerged from the shadows, his grip loosened just slightly. Jessica held her breath. Then, from deep in the woods, "Put the child down." The commanding voice shattered the night air like a gunshot. Red and blue lights flashed through the trees as officers swarmed forward, their weapons drawn, their flashlights piercing through the darkness. Mark stiffened. His entire body went rigid as he realized he had lost. Jessica saw it in his eyes. The brief flicker of realization, the moment he knew there was no escape. Emily stirred weakly in his arms. A small, barely audible whimper escaped her lips. Then, in a voice so soft Jessica almost didn't hear it, "Miss Jessica?" It was just a whisper, but it was enough. Mark flinched. His grip slackened. Jessica didn't hesitate. The moment his arms loosened, she lunged forward. Her hands wrapped around Emily's tiny frame, pulling her free, yanking her against her chest. Mark stumbled back, stunned. The officers surged forward, tackling him to the ground before he could react. Jessica barely heard the struggle, barely registered the shouted commands, the click of handcuffs snapping shut. All she could focus on was Emily, small and fragile in her arms, her breathing shallow but steady. Tears burned in Jessica's eyes as she cradled the little girl closer. "You're safe now, sweetheart," she whispered, rocking her gently. "I've got you. You're safe." Emily's tiny fingers curled weakly into the fabric of Jessica's shirt. A sob broke from Jessica's lips, pure relief crashing over her. It was over. Mark was arrested. Madeline was found. And Emily was safe. Jessica squeezed her eyes shut, pressing a trembling kiss to the little girl's forehead. She had won this battle, but deep in her heart, she knew the war wasn't over yet. The ambulance doors slammed shut with a sharp metallic clang, sealing away the broken remnants of the night's horrors. Inside, Jessica sat with Emily curled up against her, the child's small fingers clutching at her sleeve even in sleep. The paramedics worked quickly, securing the four that dripped clear fluid into Emily's veins, flushing out whatever drug Mark had forced in her tiny body. Jessica couldn't stop staring at her, at the way her breathing remained soft but steady, at the way her eyelashes fluttered slightly, as if she were still caught in a half-dream. She was safe, but barely. Across the ambulance, another paramedic worked on Madeline, who had been carefully lifted onto a stretcher moments before they left the woods. Her head was bandaged, her breathing weak, her wrists red and raw where the ropes had bitten into her skin. Jessica's throat tightened. Madeline had nearly died tonight. And if Jessica had hesitated just a few minutes longer, if she hadn't pushed past her fear and followed that gut-wrenching scream, Mark would have gotten away. With Emily, she squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the child just a little tighter, whispering words of reassurance in her soft, tangled hair. "You're safe now, sweetheart," she murmured. "I promise." The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and flashing lights, the world outside rushing past in streaks of red and blue. By the time they arrived, a team of doctors and nurses were already waiting. Jessica barely had time to register the bright lights of the emergency room before Madeline was wheeled away, her pulse weak but stable. Emily, still in a fog, was gently lifted from Jessica's arms and placed onto a small hospital bed. She made a soft sound of protest, her fingers trying to grab at Jessica even as the nurses reassured her. "I'm right here," Jessica promised, sitting beside her and taking her hand. Emily's eyes fluttered open for the briefest moment, hazy and unfocused. "Miss Jessica?" Jessica smiled, brushing back a stray curl from Emily's forehead. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart." Emily blinked slowly, her small fingers tightening around Jessica's before sleep claimed her again. A deep sigh shuddered through Jessica's body, exhaustion pulling at her bones. It was over. Mark was in custody. Emily and Madeline were safe. But the battle wasn't finished yet. An hour later, Detective Roberts entered the hospital room, her expression grim. Jessica sat up straighter, still holding Emily's hand as she slept. "What is it?" she asked, already bracing herself. Roberts didn't sugarcoat it. "When we arrested Mark, we searched his backpack." She hesitated, then placed a small, clear evidence bag on the hospital table. Inside was a bundle of passports, one for Mark, one for Emily, and one for Madeline. Jessica's stomach dropped. "He was planning to take her," she whispered. "To run." Roberts nodded. "And that's not all." She produced another bag. Inside was a long coil of rope, a knife, and a pair of sunglasses and a hat, likely meant as a crude disguise. Jessica felt sick. Mark had planned everything. Every moment. Every detail. This wasn't just a desperate act of a man who had lost control. It was premeditated. Roberts crossed her arms. "We've charged him with attempted murder, kidnapping, and multiple violations of his restraining order. With the evidence we have, there's no doubt he's going away for a long time." Jessica swallowed hard, staring down at Emily's peaceful face. A part of her felt relief. A part of her still couldn't breathe. "Thank you," she murmured. Roberts gave a small nod. "No, thank you." She studied Jessica for a long moment, then softened. "You saved their lives, Jessica. I hope you know that." Jessica glanced down at Emily's tiny fingers curled around her own. It hadn't been about being a hero. It had been about protecting the people she loved. That night, Jessica refused to leave Emily's side. The hospital had offered her a bed in a different room, but she had simply shaken her head and pulled a chair up beside Emily's hospital bed. She didn't care that her back ached. She didn't care that her body was running on pure adrenaline and exhaustion. All that mattered was the little girl sleeping beside her. Jessica stroked a hand gently over Emily's hair, letting the rhythmic sound of her breathing calm her own heartbeat. She had come so close to losing her. Too close. She wouldn't let it happen again. Not ever. Jessica took a slow breath, letting the weight of the night settle deep into her bones. She had fought so hard to save Emily and Madeline. But now came the hardest part, the healing. Jessica glanced out the hospital window, watching as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The nightmare was over, but the road to recovery had only just begun. And no matter how long it took, she would be there, always. As the first rays of dawn illuminated the hospital room, Jessica sat quietly, watching over Emily as she slept. The nightmare had finally come to an end, but the journey of healing was just beginning. There would be court hearings, long nights of recovery, and scars, both seen and unseen, that would take time to fade. But one thing was certain: Emily and Madeline were safe, and Jessica would make sure they stayed that way. Stories like this remind us of the resilience of the human spirit, the power of love, and the courage it takes to fight for what's right. But they also remind us that danger often lurks where we least expect it, and that we must always stay vigilant, not just for ourselves, but for those who need us most. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss another powerful tale of survival, hope, and justice. There are many more stories waiting to be told. Stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat, challenge what you think you know, and remind you of the strength within us all. Stay safe, stay strong, and always listen to your instincts. We'll see you in the next story.